Welcome to the latest episode of Sports Bazaar with myself, Mick Malloy, and as always, doing the heavy lifting in this epic series on the America's Cup.
Yes.
It's Titus O'Reilly.
Well, thank you. Where we left off.
Where were we now?
I know, it's an epic we're going through.
Sure
the Scots had challenged, you might remember.
Of course.
The Scots had had a challenge, and they had been beaten off by the Americans. The Americans were not thrilled by it at all, and they'd had a bit of a hissy fit.
Yep.
And they'd changed the deed of gift again. The rules again to say you got to get to the America's Cup. The ship racing in it has to get there on its own. They'd sort of put in some of these rules.
That's right. That's terrible. Now, and who's the bloke who's...
George Schuyler, the guy that changes the deed. He's passed away now.
Oh, good
So
Lord.
they can't go back to him.
So can they no longer change the deed?
You have to go to the Supreme Court
so
of
it's
New
in the
York
courts. We're now in the
if
courts.
you need to do this. But this is the point where, so the time frame, just to anchor us in where we are.
Yeah.
This is sort of around the 1890s. So America is in what it's called the Gilded Age. This is after the Civil War and Reconstruction. This is where big money comes in around Standard Oil, railways. You're getting these incredibly rich plutocrats.
Yes.
So this is like the Elon Musks, the Zuckerbergs.
The big industrialists.
The big industrialists, but on a scale as rich as those guys are now, right? So this is before America then breaks up a lot of those
Who was
big
Standard
companies. Well, Standard Oil. Well, let's start, and I'll get into Standard Oil. So this is where we're exactly going.
Ill-prepared
No,
for my questions.
once again,
Someone hasn't done their homework.
Once again, I've come in half-assed it again.
That's all right. Don't worry, I'll clear it up later.
Yeah,
You just bat on. All right.
Well, as our members know, listen to the bonus episodes, and if you're not a member, sign up. We fact-check Mick's claims regularly, and he's currently batting 50-50.
Which is pretty good.
Which everyone in the office is shocked.
is surprised.
And some of the ones you've been very good on. Like, they've been good facts. So if you're not a member, sign up to that, and you'll hear Mick's fact checks, because they are spot on. Now, so this is the Gilded Age. So much money is coming into America. And so the New York Yacht Club is being run by these huge names. So the first one is J.P.Morgan, John Pierpont Morgan.
Yes.
J.P.Morgan, the bank you'd have heard of.
Everyone
knows about him. He's still around. He was a financier and investment banker. He dominated corporate finance on Wall Street at this period. He was like, think very much the Mark Zuckerberg sort of power level, right? The Jeff Bezos level of money. He could influence whole elections, everything around it.
Was he one who famously got everyone in a room together and locked them in until they came to a resolution?
Yes,
there was some
he would do that around saving. He a few times saved the banking
economy
system of it. Now, he was also the one, to your point about US Steel and all this. He was the architect behind this industrial consolidation, which is getting multiple smaller companies together, turning them into these giant almost multinational type.
It became a thing, really, didn't it?
Yeah, so he did ones over the course of it. He put together US Steel, as you raised, International Harvester, which was a huge farming conglomerate, and General Electric, GE, which is still around to this day in various forms. So he was the one that put together all of those. He also owned a bunch of other businesses like Western Union, 21 railroads he owned in America. So this guy is like, think just money just being printed off.
Do you know the smart guy, I reckon, in all that? The guy who watched everyone running the railways and went, they're going to need barrels.
Yeah.
And the guy, I forget his name, but he just bought every barrel in America. Yeah. And he became just as important to the guy running the train stations as the trains.
Yeah.
Because he had nothing. It's like owning the software during the computer age where you go, well, how are you going to deliver?
Yeah, exactly. That's what Gates did, right?
That's what Gates did.
Stole
working for
DOS
IBM.
Off someone else and went,
you guys, if you just sign this, just allow me to control the old software,
and
I'll go on my way.
Yeah.
Just slip that under the nose.
I know. These guys were just operating on another level.
So this is like Wild West for the big industrialists.
Yeah. So J.P. Morgan's become the Commodore of the New York Yacht Club. So he's running this now.
And all their other clubs. I love the way they just start their own clubs.
Yeah, and he is funding these. This is getting to the point where these plutocrats are involved. To challenge for the America's Cup, you have to be amongst the 1%ers.
Yeah.
You have to be that rich. It's a bit like space flight now. You got Branson and Musk and everyone going, we're all going to, Bezos all going, we're going to own a space company.
Yes.
This was like the equivalent of that in the 1890s, right? You didn't buy a spaceship, you bought a yacht.
You bought a yacht
that
and you
cost
raced it.
Yeah, you got a $10 million yacht, sort of thing.
That was the dick swinging competition of the day.
That was, right? So some of the other things he did is he financed the formation of a company called the International Mercantile Marine Company. It was an Atlantic shipping company which has bought up several American and British lines.
Yes.
And J.P.Morgan, one of their lines was one of the subsidiaries was a line called the White Star Line, which ran as one of its major ships, the RMS Titanic.
Okay.
And J.P.Morgan had a private suite on the Titanic and was meant to be on it the voyage where it sunk.
So is this
spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't seen the movie? Sorry, I didn't.
Thanks a lot.
Oh, I just ruined the movie.
Thanks
for
a
people.
lot. Quick sidebar. Do you know I got kicked out of a screening of the Titanic? This is a true story.
This is once again. Your stories are so. You always put the premise to me like, Titus, you will not believe this, and I'm like, I would be shocked if you told me you'd sat through the Titanic. How did you get kicked out?
I went with my girlfriend to a screening in Newcastle. It was the height of Titanic mania.
Yeah.
We were there. I'm watching it. We were about 40 minutes in, and I was super bored. And I've just stood up and shouted out, "Oh, bring on the iceberg!" Everyone got very huffy in the cinema,
including your girlfriend,
including my girlfriend, and I got tasked to leave. And it was a win-win because I got cheered on the way out for
leaving.
Good riddance, and
you got to leave,
and I got to leave.
You're still the kid that gets kicked out of class, wants to get out of class, so does something to get kicked out. You're still the kid. It's like all these times later.
What you're saying though, this is a famous conspiracy theory surrounding the Titanic, isn't it? That he didn't get on it, so he killed every other rich man in America.
Like a lot of competition.
All the competition. He said, "Here you go. Oh, actually, I'm not going to make it." Bang! Hey, knock this into a Titanic. Knock this into an iceberg.
Sort of a Putin-esque kind of business strategy.
Now, there's been a few things said about Putin, and I just want to say it's a bit of a pile-on. There's no evidence that he had anything to do with the Wagner death.
Oh, yeah, no evidence whatsoever.
No, there's an explosion on the plane. The plane went down. It's a big conspiracy theory on the internet.
Now, the other people that are currently funding these challenges with him and running the New York Yacht Club, William K. Vanderbilt. He was the grandson of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was the biggest, richest guy in America. So he was heir to the biggest fortune. So he ran a lot of shipping, a lot of ferries, things like that around New York.
That's what I would like to be.
He inherited 55... This is William K. Vanderbilt from his grandfather, Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt. He inherited $55 million in 1890, which is the equivalent today of 1.8 billion US.
Oh, man.
So imagine just inheriting that one day. So that's...
I'd rather inherit than build it.
Now,
that's another episode.
I'd love to be in the inheritance business. There are some people I know who are in that job. So William K.
Idle Rich.
The Idle Rich.
That's me.
Oh, you and I could do Idle Rich.
I could do that. People go, "I'd be boring." Yeah. Watch this space.
You'd be Bunker Spreckles. You'd be dead in a week. It would not... Seriously.
And all my money would be in a cave.
Now, he, with his money, when he inherited this $1.8 billion, he took over, he bought from P.T. Barnum the great Roman Hippodrome in the New York and turned it and renamed it Madison Square Garden. So he was the very first one. Another guy who was in this running the New York Yacht Club is a guy called August Belmont Sr., He's an interesting guy. He was German and he worked for the Rothschilds, huge banking and financing group in Europe. And one day when they were a bit worried because the Spanish Empire was sort of falling apart over in South and Central America, and they had a lot of investments there, they said, go to Cuba. We want you to go look after all our investments over there and check on them, right? Yeah. So he goes over there and his whole plan's go to Cuba, then South America and look after the Rothschilds business. He gets there in New York and he finds that he has to postpone it because the Rothschild's New York branch had collapsed. Means there was a panic on at the time. This is the one J.P.Morgan's trying to fix.
Right.
So he makes an executive decision, because you can't just quickly ring someone. This is like you got to send a ship. So he makes an executive decision. I'll stay in New York and fix this problem here. Yep. This is where I'm needed. The Rothschilds later on tick off that this was a good idea. But he basically rescues it and builds the American business into this huge thing, and then eventually goes out on his own. The Belmont Stakes is named after him, which is one of the racing's triple crown in America. You have to win the Belmont Stakes.
Is the first one?
Named after him. Yeah, and it's named after him, just outside New York City. Now, he was... ran a lot of these things with one of his closest friends, Leonard Jerome, who was the maternal grandfather of Winston Churchill. So there's all this caught up with.
It's all happening, yeah.
So while they're all doing this, they're the rich. On the English side, they need someone rich to come and challenge.
Yes.
And so the Earl of Dunraven, his name is Wyndham Thomas Wyndham Quin, the fourth Earl of Dunraven. He steps up to the plate. Now, he's brought into extreme wealth. He's always looking for... So he's a wealthy guy, but bored.
Yeah.
So
this is where the trouble starts.
Yeah, he's looking for fun. So he was serving as a lieutenant in the 1st Life Guards, a cavalry regiment. He then became, at age 26, a war correspondent for the Daily Telegraph.
Yep.
Because he was bored. Then he got sick about writing about war, so he recruited 2 regiments of sharpshooters for the Boer War and led them into battle.
Yeah.
He's then a big game hunter. In 1974, he went over to Colorado and he just bought 15,000 acres so he could go hunting in America.
Well, hunting whatever happened to be on the property at the time.
Yeah, buffalo and wolves and all sorts of stuff. Then bears, all sorts of stuff. Jeez. He eventually just got rid of the land because he was sick of settlers kept coming and settling on the land when he wasn't there. So he'd come back and there was a whole new homestead and stuff like that. Yeah. He's also a politician.
Could have just shot them.
He could have. He also was a politician, but he co-authored a book on spiritualism, which is all about, talking to dead people, seances, all this sort of stuff.
I did not see that coming.
Now, this book, and this kind of comes up where the Americans in the end don't really like this guy, is it had strong homoerotic overtones, including references of a relationship with a guy called Daniel Douglas Home. Now, Daniel Home was a Scottish medium who had the ability to levitate, speak with the dead, and he could produce rapping and knocks on houses at will, apparently. He's one of the most famous men of his era. Okay. So when the Earl of Dunraven starts writing these things about him and Home sleeping in the same bed together and all that.
Are they biographical? Or?
Yes, they found out later in his diaries that they'd had some sort of relationship. Now, this was kind of frowned upon at the time, right? So in 1893, Dunraven issues a challenge. He'd built a ship called Valkyrie II to challenge. And this is an interesting one because the Americans, in response, build a boat called Vigilant as the defender. Now, this is the first time with Vigilant and Valkyrie 2 where people are starting to go, let's build a ship. It's purely for racing. So Vigilant was a massive departure from all the previous ones. So she had bronze instruments everywhere. Everything was not worried too much about whether it could make a trip anywhere across the Atlantic or anything. It was built just for the race.
Yes.
So it didn't have like a kitchen downstairs. It didn't have beds. It didn't have all the... So they're starting to go this way.
Moose head over the fire.
So these ships suddenly are very expensive. They're very big. To give you an idea, unlike you'd see America's Cups boats now, which might have 6 to 8 people on them.
Yeah.
These boats, to give you an idea of how big... the Valkyrie 2, the Vigilant, the Defender, it would have up to 60 men on the boat, all on one side. Crew, just all there to keep it balanced. They run from one side of the ship to the other. So these aren't these small boats. These are massive boats, right? Powerful, big boats. And they're costing a fortune.
Wow.
And then after the race, they're almost useless.
Yeah.
They can't be used for cruising or anything. So you have to have enormous amounts of money to race it. So this all happens now. The Americans win this race close. It's very close, but they win all 3 races. Lord Dunraven returns the next year, returns 2 years later in 1895 with the Valkyrie 3. and they built another ship, the Americans too. And this was an incredibly famous ship called the Defender, the Americans, and it was so built just for racing that it only lasted 6 years after the race, even though it was rebuilt one time, because it corroded. It wasn't built to last. It was just purely like a racing, like a race car would be. You can't take an F1 car and then just drive it as your daily commute. It's like that. Yeah. So this race becomes incredibly between the Valkyrie 3 and the Defender. This is where it starts to become quite the animosity grows with the Earl of Dunraven. So the Defender wins the first one, although the Earl of Dunraven accuses the Americans of cheating. He says, you weighed the boats because you have to have meet all these criteria.
Yes.
And he accuses them of overnight sneaking in and putting more ballast in their ship so it can ride low in the water and have more stability. In the second race, the Defender wins, the American race wins, and the British yacht, Valkyrie 3, it's been disqualified for getting in the way. So there's a point where they're meant to give way and they don't. So it's disqualified anyway. The Lord of Dunraven says, well, the only reason I had to almost hit the other boat was because you've got these enormous fleets coming out of spectators and they're getting in my way, and they're purposely getting in my way.
Is there merit to this claim?
I think there's a lot of merit. He says he wrote to them and said, today on the way home, 8 or 9 steamers crossed my bow, several were to the windward of me, and what was worse is a block of steamers was steaming level with me and close under my lee. I sailed nearly the whole distance in tumbling broken water in the heavy wash of these steamers. So he was just saying, this is absurd. You're not controlling these ships. It's not like now where they're all kept away. And they're purposely getting in my way, making the water hard, but they're not doing it to your boat.
Sure.
So the Earl of Dunraven is furious.
Of course he is.
He's accused them of cheating.
Yeah.
And they've reviewed it and said no. He
says, done an internal review.
As always, they've investigated themselves. The Valkyrie 3 comes out, but is not got the proper sails up, is not competing before the race starts. They sort of compete before.
A bit of jousting
to get in the right spot, and it becomes very obvious that his whole plan is just to come out and then, in a fit of pique, just quit. Will just quit. He doesn't. So the starting gun goes, and he just doesn't.
He's cracked it.
He cracks it and leaves. Right, and they are all like in shock that he's done this, and so they can't believe it. It's just this bizarrest moment in America's Cup history where someone just basically goes, stuff you. So Lord Dunraven goes back to England and writes an article in the London Field magazine, one of our favourite publications. And he writes publicly now an accusation that the Defender had been cheating, that they had moved ballast in overnight, the ship was lower in the water, he actually publicly makes the whole thing.
There's a cavalcade of disgruntled contenders, right?
There is heaps of disgruntled.
And yet they always seem shocked that they get accused.
Yeah, absolutely shocked. So this creates huge issues between England and America, as you can imagine. The British and the Americans, they're furious. Now, the New York Yacht Club, of course, respond to this. They say, we've investigated this and everything the Lord of Dunraven said is untrue.
Right.
And they say, the Earl of Dunraven, an honorary member of the club, has publicly charged foul play on the part of the Defender. Lord Dunraven, by this course, has forfeited the high esteem which led to his election as an honorary member of this club. Therefore, it is resolved that the privileges of honorary membership heretofore extended to the Earl of Dunraven are hereby withdrawn.
Wow.
And that his name be removed from the list of honorary members of the club.
Jeez.
And this is seen as one of the lowest points, once again, between the British and the Americans. It happens a few times. It's rescued by a guy who goes on to create basically what we could almost call a whole era of the America's Cup, and that would be called the Lipton era.
Yeah.
The man that challenges next is from an Irish family that had moved to Scotland, so he's Scottish, and his name is Thomas Lipton.
Right.
Now, Thomas Lipton was born in a tenement in Glasgow in 1848. So poor was this family. Like, this is as dirt poor in the Industrial Revolution, child labour.
It's Glasgow.
Yeah, Glasgow, which was seen as the worst.
Town.
And it was seen at the time, the Glasgow slums were the worst of the worst in the world. Worse than London, worse than what Charles Dickens was writing about.
Well, when it came to Glasgow, the hardest drinkers in the world, they say they drank like that because it was a celebration to get to the end of another day.
Yeah.
And it was like a reward for survival.
Yeah, just
you would go out and get blasted.
No, it was like...
That's a tough town.
So he's born into this family. He has 3 brothers and 1 sister. They all die in infancy. He's the only one that survives. So, this is the tough town he is in. He, from a very young age, he's working lots of odd jobs. He works on a ship as a cabin boy. He works as a shirt maker. He runs errands. He's doing everything. His family owns a very small store, but it's like literally sells some eggs and some milk and butter and stuff. It's it's a tiny milk bar kind of sort of store. He eventually makes enough money to go to America because he hears this is the land of opportunity, America. So he's like, I'm going to get to America. So he spends 5 years in America just working and traveling all over the country. He's works on a tobacco plantation in Virginia, as an accountant and bookkeeper at a rice plantation in South Carolina, as a door-to-door salesman in New Orleans, a farmhand in New Jersey, and finally as a grocery assistant in New York.
Yeah, there's no work for home in those days, was there? It was really...
He's not zooming into it.
No, Zoom meetings. You had to get out there and get amongst
And
it.
he's like, 16, 17 at this age, right? Like, he's young, right? Yeah. And he's all off in his own in the world. He gets to know America very well, but the one thing he learns about in America is their love of marketing. He sees that they're doing like this packaging and marketing, not just in ads, but marketing in that you actually package up butter and put a brand on it.
Right.
Rather than just saying, here's some butter.
Here's some butter.
You start to brand like
here's the best butter.
Yeah, and you have images on it and everything. And he sees and he goes back. So he goes back to Glasgow and starts helping his parents run their shop. But he's now got all this knowledge that's not happening in London of selling to the middle class and the working class. You got to get the prices low, but you need to make it like package it up and get your reputation in order. And he starts doing this, right? So while he's doing this, he starts opening his first proper shop. It's called Lipton's Market in Glasgow, and it becomes very successful with this model. Over the next 20 years, he expands it into a chain of 300 stores all over Britain, everywhere. He's sleeping under the counter of the latest store whenever he's opening it, and he's ploughing the profits back in. He's just working his butt off.
It's the Amazon model.
Then he had done so well that he turned his attention to tea, and he sees that tea is becoming important, but it's too expensive for the working class.
Yes.
And he starts to think, well, if I could sell it to working class and middle class families and make the price cheaper, we could clean up here. So he secretly books a passage to Australia, but he actually gets off at Colombo in Ceylon at the time, in what becomes Sri Lanka, and he visits the tea plantations for himself. So he's a can-doer.
I like this story.
And he figures out that I can purchase the price of tea directly from here for half of what I was willing to pay in Scotland.
Right.
At wholesale. I can make an absolute killing. Also, rather than buying it from China, Ceylon is closer.
Right. Yeah.
So he starts buying up these plantations in Sri Lanka and names his tea Lipton's Tea,
right?
Which exists to this day.
Can I suggest something? He's going to need a boat.
So he now controls the process from picking the tea to packaging it to selling it. He makes an absolute fortune.
Incredible.
And Lipton's tea is still incredibly well known, obviously, to this day. He is just known for pouring all his profits back into the community.
Yeah.
So he just says,
Jeez, I really like this story.
yeah, I'm giving free milk and cookies to all the kids in the neighbourhood. Come down to my factory, and a line just forms, and or I'm buying this and buying that, or I'm funding this.
Unheard of in these times.
Yeah. He's just everyone says this guy is the nicest man you will ever meet in real life too. Like, it's not an act. He just is a really decent guy. The Alexandra, the Princess of Wales, meets him through this charity work and likes him so much that she says to her husband, Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales, who is the heir apparent to Queen Victoria, you got to meet this guy, you got to love him. And they all just fall in love with him. They think he's this charitable, self-made, rich guy.
He's a good egg.
But he's so charismatic and likeable. They all like him. Queen Victoria likes him. At Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897, he gave £20,000 worth of dinners for the London poor, which is a huge amount of money at the time. So he just buys meals for all the poor for her thing. King Edward becomes king. Once Queen Victoria does, and so he's friends with the king. He becomes king with King George. They go sailing together all the time. So this is a guy who's just rose to the absolute top. He then incorporates all his stores, shops, and his various things, and creates a business called Lipton's Limited, which he floats on the share market for the English public. And so he becomes even richer through that, but he loses control of the company. So he's still involved in advising it, but it's run by a board now because of the share market. What he does do, though, is he doesn't sell his American company. So he still owns Lipton Inc. in America, which still owns all the tea plantations in Ceylon as well, which he's selling to the British business. So he thinks, how do I build up my American side of the business? And he thinks, well, the America's Cup would be good publicity.
Really?
This could be a good way for me to kind of get my name out of there. It's a great marketing campaign, and the cost of the ship and everything is still cheaper than a marketing campaign in America. I'll just challenge for the America's Cup.
It's incredible.
So he challenges for the America's Cup.
As a marketing device, not out of a deep-seated desire to win the America's Cup.
He loves sailing and he'd like to win, but that's not. But in his mind, he's a master of marketing. He's incredible. Like, if I come over and do this, So he goes over to challenge. He challenges through the Royal Ulster Yacht Club of Belfast Island, so Northern Ireland, part of the British Empire, obviously. He'd been blackballed from the more prestigious Royal Yacht Squadron, even though he's best mates with the royal family.
Why?
The squadron members objected to his work in trade, that he was actually a worker and wasn't an aristocrat. But he's in America, and he's like, this is great. Now, boats here, this becomes an incredibly expensive race. So you've got J.P.Morgan funding the Americans, and you've got Thomas Lipton. So brands that we know now, the original guys are both challenging this. And these races, Lipton calls every race, he enters a ship called the Shamrock.
Yes.
And when he challenges more than once, he just adds like Shamrock 1, Shamrock 2, like that. So they race, and eventually the Americans basically win the 3 races. But it was seen as a great success because even though he lost, it was an incredibly expensive exercise. But he loses, and he's so nice about it.
Yes.
He's so good-natured, charming. He's a good loser.
He's a good loser.
I had a great time.
He doesn't mind their cheating.
I had a great time. It was wonderful to be here with you all. He goes over to America again. This time he's challenging a boat called the Columbia is the Defender, is the boat. It wins the first race by 1 minute and 20 seconds, the second by 3 minutes and 35 seconds, and the third race by 41 seconds. So Shamrock 2 has lost 3-0, but
closed the gap.
There's seconds. It's the closest America's Cup up to this point. So it shows you that Lipton, even though he's like jocular and friendly, he is over there doing this.
Feels like it's almost time for a rule change.
So in 1914, Lipton's challenged again, and he's sailing over there. And while they're sailing to the America's Cup for 1914, Germany declares war on Britain, and so they're meant to meet up with Vanderbilt, who's the Commodore of the New York Yacht Club by this point, and they don't have a radio or anything, so they don't know that war's broken out.
Okay, yeah.
So they're crossing across, and when Vanderbilt shows up to meet Lipton in Bermuda, All the navigational aids had been moved from local reefs so that Germans couldn't get through, wouldn't know where the reefs were. So he almost crashed on that. And then when he arrives, the shore battery shoots a warning shot.
At Lipton?
At the Americans who were coming to meet Lipton. So it's all called off. So 1920, the war stops it till 1920.
Yes.
Lipton challenges again. This point, the Americans want to move it to Rhode Island, Newport, Rhode Island, and away from New York. And Lipton says...
Why is that? What's their motivation?
New York Harbour's busy, smaller, condensed. They want to be more open waters, better sailing. It will be better sailing.
Sure.
Lipton says, no way. I'm here for New York, you know. I'm here to promote my tea and everything, you know.
Of course.
And tea is going nuts at this point. So... this one is incredibly close. He comes within one race of taking the trophy home, and the Americans win that final race. And so suddenly it's very, very close because the Shamrock, we're up to the Shamrock 4, that it wins the first 2 races, and the Americans
that's incredible,
freaking out.
Now you've got their full attention.
Goodyear. Chairman, Paul W. Litchfield, at this point, he starts a tradition of naming their blimps after America's Cup winners. So the Goodyear blimp is always, each one is named after an America's Cup winner. So Lipton comes in 1930 and challenges another time. It's finally been moved to Newport, Rhode Island. And it's better. It's a big blow for the city's economy, but it's better for the racing. And it stays at Newport, Rhode Island for 53 years until a yacht called Australia 2 comes along and swoops in. So these are these ships built to these things. They're called the J-class yachts, and they're seen as the most beautiful yachts that ever raced in the America's Cup. Lipton's 79 when he challenges with the Shamrock 4 in 1930. A ship called the Enterprise was chosen to defend, and Lipton loses this one 4-0. It's his 5th loss in a row. And at this point, he'd become so beloved for how graceful he was as a losing that the Americans even felt bad that he hadn't ever won one. So he's challenged 5 times.
Yeah.
Lipton joke, I drank my tea from the saucer for the reason that I could not lift the cup. That was the quote he gave. So they all love him. A letter appears in the newspaper editorial in the New York Times from the movie star, cowboy and vaudeville performer Will Rogers.
Oh, yes.
And he says, what do we say to this? Let everybody send $1 apiece for a fund to buy a loving cup for Sir Thomas Lipton, bigger than the one he would have got if he had won, contributed to by everyone that really admires a fine sportsman. He says, send it to, I suggest, a Lipton Cup fund in care of Mayor Walker in New York. Let Jimmy buy it and present it on behalf of everything. So this is the call. Money floods in. The mayor says, all right, I'll do that. No problem. Letters flood in. And within 10 days, $16,000 US, which is like almost $1 million, has come in with Americans just all sending in single dollar bills.
Incredible.
Because they love Lipton so much. Lipton sails home and says he'd be back for another challenge. And he returns 2 months later to be able to collect this cup that they'd bought for him. It was designed by Tiffany's. It's made of 18-karat gold and stood 18 inches high.
What?
It said on the plinth, it says, in the name of the hundreds and thousands of Americans and well-wishers of Sir Thomas Johnstone Lipton. So this is how much the Americans love him. The cost of his second place finishes was tens of millions of dollars in today's money for these 5 challenges he did. And it was far below what he always knew, and historians have looked at it and said it's far below what he would have to have paid in advertising fees.
Yes.
Because in this time, his tea company becomes the biggest in America, and he owns that. And among other things, his image in full yachting uniform appears on his tea products well into the 1990s, long after people realised he had anything to do with the America's Cup. Though he actually tried to win, some people say if he'd actually won, he probably wouldn't have had the business success that he would have had. A year on from his 5th challenge, Thomas Lipton passes away at 83 and never gets to challenge again. He's a 5-time loser, the most ever, but the most loved. he bequeaths his entire fortune to his native city of Glasgow for charitable works.
Unbelievable. What a great story.
So that brings us to the end of the Lipton era. Where we're going to get into next when we come back is the last of the English challengers. And we're not far away from when a little nation called Australia decides to get involved.
Oh, here we go. Thank you, Titus O'Reilly.